I've read your book, Sandor, over the years since I've been in America, and I'm just super excited to jump into this. But I kind of feel like before we do, to acknowledge that this event was originally in person, and if you and I had been in the same room, there is no way we wouldn't have shared some fermented foods together, because that would be rude. So I would not describe myself as a master fermenter, but I'm certainly an enthusiastic fermenter. And this crazy serendipity happened today where a friend of mine, Reggie, was leaving my house and said, hey, I'm going to Sandor's farm. And I was like, you've got to take this jar of, and I just grabbed whatever was in my fridge. You got to take this jar of fermented food. And it made it all the way to Tennessee. And so even though we are disconnected in person, we are connected through this fermentation, and I am so excited. So can we just kick off by, you've not tasted this yet, right?
I have not tasted it, but here I have some in my fingers. It's this beautiful bright pink kraut.
It's got a bit of spice to it. I hope that doesn't put you off. Oh, I need to eat some too.
Oh yeah. No, I love it. It's a little bit spicy. It's got some cumin in it too. I love the bright pink color. That's what happens with red cabbage, or a mix of red and green. Actually, I just this weekend when I was in New York, I met this person who is like a food chemist, and he explained that it's the anthocyanins that make red cabbage red or sometimes bluish, but the tint changes depending on the acidity. So higher acidity makes it more red, more pink, and less blue. And when it starts out and it's not acidic yet, it's more of like a bluish tone. So that was interesting new information.
That is good. Can you pick out my secret ingredient? This is like an on-camera live test. And it's a super sneaky one that I feel like
not the cumin, which I definitely picked out the cumin.
You got the cumin. I was impressed with that. You've got the hot peppers, and there's one more spice that I threw in that I just had on my shelf, and I thought I got to.
I am not a super taster, but what is it?
I found this spice that was a dehydrated black lime, and it's just got something that I just thought would work with the hot spice, and that kind of tang on your tongue isn't just the ferment. I think it's that black lime coming through as well.
Okay, beautiful.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. How lovely to be able to, share kraut from 250 miles away. I love that.
We got lucky. And I feel like it was so important to do that because we're talking about your book, Fermentation Journeys, and it's obviously all about you journeying all over the world and finding these stories and meeting these people, and it's just beautiful narrative of your adventures and your journeys. And so again, us doing this workshop and you not being able to journey, at least the sauerkraut could journey, and that was important to me. There was one thing that occurred to me as soon as I sent it out the door. I was like, is sending fermented foods to like one of the most famous fermenters out there like a silly thing to do? Like, would you have preferred like a cheesecake or something?
No. I love when people share their ferments with me because, I'm a creature of habit. I do things the way I do them. And, sometimes I experiment, but I'm not a mad experimentalist, really. I often do the same things over and over again. And especially with something like fermenting vegetables, it's just super fun and exciting to see, what like creative twist people bring to it. So no, I always love when I'm gifted things. Actually, I just got back from like 5 days in New York, and I've got so many things. This is something people are doing with koji, but this one is a cornbread amino paste, and this one is a chocolate chip cookie amino paste. So I haven't tried them yet, but I very much look forward to trying these. And when people say amino paste, it's like a sort of a generic of the type of thing that miso is. Mm-hmm. So, some sort of high protein substrate plus koji and salt.
So koji is like cropping up in my life a few times recently in a way that I feel like I'm destined to try and make it. Can you talk a little bit about how accessible, like what level of fermentation expertise do we need to be at to access it? Because you always make it so accessible.
Sure. So koji is the Japanese name for grains or sometimes beans, or chefs around the world right now are kind of illustrating by example that you can grow koji on virtually anything edible. I've played around with growing koji now on beets. I see people growing koji on, pork chops. It's very versatile, but, traditionally it's grown on rice, barley, soybeans, and it's usually not a food in and of itself, but it's a fungus, a mold, a filamentous fungus that has all of these digestive enzymes. So there are amylase enzymes that can break down complex carbohydrates into simple fermentable sugars that are essential for making sake. There are protease enzymes that break down proteins into amino acids, and that's like what gives soy sauce and miso their incredible flavors. That's so much more dramatic than the flavor of an unfermented soybean. And many other enzymes. So there are these like enzyme powerhouses that have quite a few traditional applications, but experimental chefs today are just using them in like sort of wildly varied ways. Now, to grow koji, first of all, you need to obtain a starter. The internet makes that really very accessible, and there's plenty of websites within the US as well as in Japan selling koji through the internet and through the mails, or selling koji starter, which is the spores of a fungus called Aspergillus oryzae. And you can grow koji from that. The only thing challenging about growing koji is that you have to maintain a temperature roughly between 80 degrees and 90 degrees Fahrenheit for up to about 48 hours. So, that can be tricky to figure out. I have basically a defunct refrigerator with a few extra holes that I drilled in it for air circulation. And then I use an incandescent light bulb in a simple clip fixture at the bottom, and then a little temperature controller with a sensor at the top. And so whenever the temperature dips below about 85 degrees, the light bulb turns on, and when the temperature reaches 85 degrees, the light bulb turns off. So, what's hard about growing koji is, sort of creating the right kind of environment. On a hot summer day, you could do it without creating a special environment, but in more typical temperatures, you have to figure out a way to keep it warm. And in the book, I have a little section about different improvisational ways that I've done it or seen other people do it. So I have ideas and I have directions for how to make koji. But koji is amazing. I've been making it for years to make miso. I've branched out in recent years to making sake, making soy sauce, making mirin. I make this stuff called shio koji, which just means salt koji. It's koji and salt and water fermented together and then sort of blended into a paste. I have this like chestnut shio koji, which is out of this world. I grew koji on chestnuts, and then I use that to marinate all kinds of things, vegetables, meat, and so basically it's a seasoning, but it also has all of these active enzymes. So it'll make things sweet, and it'll make complex carbohydrate foods sweeter, like vegetables. It'll make meats tastier because it'll break down proteins. So it's really just this extraordinary, transformative substance. And there, I have a big section of the book about koji, but I would say, it's harder than making sauerkraut. Like if we're talking about sauerkraut, I'd say you don't need anything. Everything you need is in your kitchen already. Like all you need is a jar and a cutting board and a knife and salt. But, for koji, you have to figure out like creating a zone that stays this temperature.
For sure. And I loved that about the book in terms of the recipes, is even for the more, if we use the word complicated ones, they're still very accessible. And I kind of felt like they felt accessible because they were always framed within these people that you had met that had been doing it for years and sharing that information. And so just to kind of zoom back a little bit, I guess, is one of my takeaways from the book that I really enjoyed was it felt like the book was as much about the people as the food. And that feels really important. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that kind of like broader picture of how it really feels as if fermentation is like a connector of humanity, while also appreciating the beautiful diversity that's displayed within the book. I know you got thoughts on that type of philosophy.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that, fermentation is a connector. Fermentation is quite nearly universal. I hesitate to say that it's universal because I don't have encyclopedic knowledge, but I have not been able to come up with any examples of culinary traditions that do not incorporate fermentation. And so, fermentation is quite nearly universal. And, my thinking about why that is so is, the simple fact that has been illuminated by microbiology that all of the food that we eat, all of the plants and all of the animal products that, are part of the human diet and anything that could be, are populated by microorganisms and never by singular organisms, always by elaborate communities of organisms. And some of those organisms obviously have the capacity to decompose the food into something that nobody would ever want to put into their mouths. But, everywhere in the world, simply through our human powers of observation and analysis and trial and error, people figured out not necessarily the microbial agents that were behind them. That didn't really come until the 19th century. But people observed under what conditions does the food decompose and under what conditions does the food become enhanced in some way. People talk a lot about preservation, and certainly for a lot of fermentations, preservation is the primary practical objective when we're talking about, sauerkraut or kimchi or any kind of vegetable fermentation, when we're talking about yogurt or cheese or any kind of dairy fermentation. Preservation is the major practical benefit, but that's not the only practical benefit. And in certain kinds of ferments, that's not even that. It's not about preservation at all. Like for instance, there's a huge amount of fermentation of grains and of beans. Nobody's ever fermented a grain or a bean in order to preserve them because, they preserve so well in their mature state when they're dry. And as long as you can keep them dry, they will be effectively preserved. But, part of what enables them to preserve so well is their dryness and their density. They're populated by microorganisms, but the microorganisms fundamentally lack the water in order to act. So the first step of every fermentation of grains or beans is simply to soak them, which reawakens dormant organisms and let them start doing their thing. And the benefits of fermenting beans and grains have to do with digestibility, removing compounds that we could think of as anti-nutrients, making minerals that are part of these foods more accessible by breaking down chemical bonds that our bodies can't break down. And also giving them flavor. I mean, grains and beans have, think about soybeans. Think about like the flavor of a plain soybean compared to the flavor of soy sauce or miso. The fermentation unleashes flavor by breaking down the proteins into amino acids. We end up with much greater flavor complexity. So other benefits include this sort of pre-digestion, making nutrients more bioavailable, making things more flavorful, and in the case of fermenting grains in particular, making them lighter. Think about, how dense a loaf of bread would be if there were no pockets of carbon dioxide. And so, it takes what would otherwise be like a brick and just gives it this sort of, lightness and appealing texture. So there's a lot of benefits of fermentation, but around the world, I mean, I would say that it's important to recognize that fermentation is not a unified set of practices, from which different cultures are pulling the ones that are relevant. I mean, fermentation really arose independently everywhere. But from the earliest times, I would say there has been, cross-cultural influence. So, people in one place figure out one method for fermenting something, people in another place maybe figure out another method, and just through the, migrations that have been part of humanity forever, people learn from other people that they encounter from other places. And so I would say that an exchange of information and technology about fermentation is very much like the way seeds spread. So sure, everything has their place of origin that we can, people have been able to roughly pinpoint. But then, things have been spreading for long periods of time, sometimes without even human assistance. Sometimes it's been other kinds of animals spreading seeds. In certain cases, it might be just the wind or serendipity. But frequently it's been through migrations, trading, and the same thing happens with ideas of fermentation. So, for instance, sauerkraut, which was this was my gateway into fermentation, and I'm very devoted to sauerkraut, and I always have different kinds of sauerkrauts around in my kitchen. But the historical literature all talks about this idea that sauerkraut comes from China, or rather that the idea of fermenting vegetables under a brine comes from China, and that it was the nomadic people of Central Asia that sort of encountered Chinese methods of fermenting vegetables in a brine and carried these ideas westward into Central Asia and Eastern Europe and beyond. And so, I really went to China in order to learn about vegetable fermentation there, really like in search of the historical roots of sauerkraut. And I mean, in my 2 weeks that I spent in a small part of China, I did not find anything quite like sauerkraut, but I mean, I found beautiful styles of fermenting vegetables. And, in my book, I have a recipe for, I have a few different Chinese vegetable fermentation recipes, but, the one that I've really incorporated into my day-to-day life is something called pao cai, which is a perpetual brine. So you mix this brine with salt and a little bit of sugar and spicing. And so I have a recipe in the book, but I play around with different spices. I mean, the one I have right now has ginger, black cardamom. That's probably the most, sort of unfamiliar to people, but it's really, really delicious. It's a much different looking spice than the cardamom pods that were more familiar to me. Szechuan peppercorns, chili peppers, star anise, and I put a little bit of licorice root in it. And so I make this brine, and then at first it takes a couple of weeks to ferment the first batch of vegetables in it. But as the brine comes to life, I mean, like in the last couple of weeks where I've been making a lot of this because I've had these events, I mean, it gets foamy. I mean, it gets so active, and you know, if you slice the vegetables relatively thinly, you can leave the vegetables in for just like a day, and they're pickled. So, you know, and over time you have to replenish the salt. You might have to add more ginger. You know, you need to use your taste to evaluate, you know, what it needs over time. But, you know, I mean, this woman who introduced us to this, Mrs. Ding in Chengdu, I mean, she had a crock of pao tsai that was years old, and she just kept on harvesting pickles out of it and putting fresh vegetables in, harvesting vegetables out, putting more vegetables in. So I mean, I think that there's a lot of influence. So here's this ancient influence that, like, you know, people in Eastern Europe learned about sauerkraut from people in China through intermediaries, these nomadic people. But I think that there's a lot of cultural cross-pollination. And honestly, that's why I decided to organize the book rather than geographically. You know, this is my trip to China. This is my trip to Colombia. I organized it thematically, really to be able to explore, you know, some of the similarities that are so stark, as well as some of the differences.
Yeah, and that really comes across. And I think I appreciate that you did that, because it, like I say, it really, I think about this in food in general, but specifically with fermentation, that, you know, it really accentuates the oneness as opposed to the otherness when we can share food and food traditions, and just to see that similarity, that it's everywhere. And yeah, I really appreciated that about the book. I wondered if, you know, you do such a good job as taking us around the world following your journeys, but I wondered, I mean, I'm sure you've got some super exciting things happening in your kitchen. I'm curious about what's in your fridge right now. What's on your shelves? What are you into? We might not have enough time to do everything, but if you could just give us a quick overview of some of your exciting projects, I think I would love to hear about it.
I mean, the things that I have arrayed in front of me are mostly things from the book. Just because that's my central focus right now, is talking to people about my new book. So here, I have a glass of, this is miju. This is like Chinese style sticky rice alcohol.
Oh, I remember reading about that one. Yes.
Oh my God. And it's like so good. I mean, strong, delicious, really lovely. You can see that, like, you know, kind of starchy rice alcohol look. I mean, it looks a lot like fresh sake. Mm-hmm. So I've got this, and then this is the residue of that. So I just use this little strainer to strain this, but this is the, you know, kind of like decomposed rice that's left, but it's decomposed rice with the koji enzymes and also with yeast. So, like, you know, you could make bread with a couple of tablespoons of that, and it'll just rise your bread really quickly. It's got a beautiful flavor. You know, I use it in scrambled eggs. I mix it with my scrambled eggs and scramble it, and it's delicious. In the book, I have a couple of recipes and a lot of ideas for, you know, if people get into making miju or sake, things you can do with kasu, which is the Japanese name for the residue, the partially digested residue. One of the things you can do, and this is a project that is almost exactly a year old. I made these on November 25th, but this is kasuzuke. So this is basically like pickle. This is a purple daikon pickled for like 11 and a half months now in kasu, which is with a little bit of salt and sugar added to it. Oh my God. I mean, I just can't believe it. I mean, this is like pickles that like taste a little bit like soy sauce. You know, they're kind of just developing this like umami edge to them that's reminding me of soy sauce.
Have you
But I
fermented
want to show.
anything? Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I was just curious if, just as you were saying that about your almost 1 year project, I, by accident, because I left it in the basement, but I accidentally fermented okra for 365 days. And the whole thing like just broke apart. And to look at was this kind of like just, it wasn't great to look at. But I did persuade my wife and some friends that were staying to try it with me. And that umami-ness, it was so complex. And like there were some hot peppers that had broken down and you could like string the whole thing and it wasn't going to win anyone over to liking okra. But the flavor was just mind blowing. And is that something that you've noticed just always continues to develop? Or is there like a drop off point where you're like, oh, gone too far?
well, I mean, what happens with vegetables? So, okay, the section about kasuzuke in my book is actually from these people I've become friendly with who have a business in Berkeley called the Cultured Pickle Shop. And they're just doing some of the most wonderful pickles that I've encountered. And so they wrote a section about kasuzuke, and they've talked to me quite a bit about it. And so they recommend waiting, let's say, at least 9 months or so before you eat them. But then they've experimented with aging them for years, and so what they say is that you get more and more flavor of the byproducts and less flavor of the original vegetable. So, what they're looking for is harvesting it at the point where there's still a flavor of the original vegetable enhanced by the byproducts. Uh-huh. Before they get to the point where the flavor of the original vegetable disappears altogether and is just replaced by these fermentation byproduct flavors. So now, I mean, the additional issue is the vegetable itself decomposing. And so, I mean, that has a lot to do with salt content. Like higher salt content will slow down the enzymes that cause decomposition, and cooler temperatures. That's the biggest thing, is cooler temperatures. I mean, in southeastern summer temperatures, everything will just turn to mush. But I mean, in Vermont a few years ago, this farmer with a value-added business making sauerkraut and kimchi, Flack Family Farms, but Doug Flack disappeared into his cellar in Vermont. He brought up 3-year-old sauerkraut, which was great. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to tell it was 3 years old. I mean, to me, it tasted just like a 3-month-old sauerkraut would have been. But his root cellar really stays the earth temperature. My root cellar is not as deep, and I live in a place where the summer gets really hot. So my root cellar in the summertime gets to 75 degrees. And so when I've tried leaving vegetables through the summer, they end up being like baby food by August. So, I like right now I have this huge vessel, 200-liter vessel, like 50 some gallons, full of daikon radishes and some cabbages fermenting. And that's great all winter. That's great all spring, but I got to give that all away by the end of June. Otherwise it'll turn into mush. So, temperatures are a real limiting factor. In places with, colder temperatures, you just have greater possibility of longer term preservation just by virtue of more moderate temperatures.
And it's kind of crazy, really, that in the colder areas, they probably have more need of longer preservation through fermentation than the tropical areas.
It's very, very elegant, really. Because I mean, the places where you need long-term preservation, it's easy to do long-term preservation. The places where it's more challenging to do long-term preservation, honestly, there's less necessity for it.
Yeah.
I want to show you one other kind of pickle, okay? And then I see that I see a really great question, and I want to encourage if other people have questions to pose them. So this is another perpetual medium, but rather than a traditional kind of thing, this is like a newer, more experimental thing that a one-time student of mine in Tasmania in Australia, a fellow named Adam James, had this idea when a farmer friend of his had like in excess of turmeric and was trying to figure out something to do with this turmeric. And so Adam ended up taking 100 kilos of turmeric and grinding it up with lots of garlic and some turnips and salt and just enough water to turn it into a smooth paste, and turned it into a perpetual pickling medium. And I've been doing that too. So this is turmeric. I actually bulked it up this year with some fresh turmeric, but the base of this is a year old that I made it at the end of last summer. And then I bury vegetables in it. So here, this is a daikon radish that has been buried in this perpetual pickling medium. And I'm going to just cut a slice because, especially with like a white vegetable like this, you just get this beautiful cross section that's like yellow on the outside and turns this so it's bright yellow on the outside and then it's still white on the inside.
That was one of the ones that I was very excited to try, because I've got a surplus of turmeric and it just like seemed like it would turn anything into something delicious.
No, it's so wonderful.
Have you tried it with ginger? I feel like you could do the same paste but with ginger.
Well, actually, my paste has ginger in it. I used ginger and turmeric, and I think more and more people are discovering that you can grow turmeric outside of the tropics, and I've been growing it the last 3 or 4 years here in Tennessee. But I've met people even like up in New York State who are growing turmeric.
Yeah. We have some black turmeric and we have some green turmeric. I feel like I need to send you some because you could make different colored pickling bases. That would be really cool to play around with.
But for me, the take home, I love sauerkraut, but it's super exciting just seeing how many different possibilities there are for fermenting vegetables. And, dry salting is really the most straightforward way. That's the sauerkraut method. You shred, create surface area, salt to taste, season however you like it, squeeze it or pound it until it gets nice and juicy, pack it into your vessel to get it submerged. That works really well, but it's just fun to learn about these perpetual brines and, burying it in turmeric. And, there's a lot of possibilities.
Do you want to answer this this question? Because I feel like a lot of people have this question, so it'd be nice to address it before we continue around the world. I'll ask it for you so everyone can hear. It's asking, what do you tell folks who are intimidated or hesitant to ferment their own foods?
Well, okay. First of all, let me say I've given up on the idea that everybody needs to ferment food themselves in their home. I feel like, to me, what's important is anyone who has the slightest interest or inkling not be intimidated to do it. And it's very easy to feel intimidated because, most of us grew up, hearing about how scary bacteria are. And, certainly I did. It's really only in recent years that there's been much conversation about, all the important things that bacteria do for us. Like in the period of time when I was growing up, all we ever were hearing about is, the potential danger of bacteria and how they need to be avoided and how we have all these chemicals that you can use to kill them. Without denying that there exist pathogenic bacteria that have the potential to make us sick, it's really important to recognize that, both for, our human bodies as biological systems, and for specific environments, whether it's the soil in our gardens or whether it's the jar of sauerkraut, it is bacteria that are our major protection against the really very limited range of bacteria that can make us sick. So, I mean, bacteria are not our enemies. Bacteria are the matrix for all life on planet Earth. And prokaryotic cells, which is how biologists would classify bacteria, but prokaryotic cells were the earliest forms of life. Bacteria and archaea. And, there's a broad consensus in the field of evolutionary biology that all life is descended from prokaryotic cells. And that prokaryotic cells gave rise to eukaryotic cells, which is what, our bodies, as well as other animals and plants and fungi are composed of, as eukaryotic cells. But eukaryotic beings have never lived without the prokaryotes. And, just as a healthy human body is host to more than 1 trillion bacteria in incredible diversity, the same is true of an okra plant or a carrot plant or a tree, any kind of a plant or any kind of an animal or any kind of an insect. And, all forms of life are multi-layered, supporting other forms of life at different scales. And, these organisms that are part of us are not, they're not freeloaders. They're not parasites. They give us a lot of our functionality. They enable us to exist and to thrive. And, bacteria in our bodies, enable us to effectively digest food and assimilate nutrients from the food. What we call our immune system is the work of bacteria largely. And then we're learning all these new ways that we had no idea of before, like our brain chemistry, serotonin, and, other chemical compounds that determine how we think and how we feel are regulated by bacteria in our gut in ways that are not fully understood. But, the bacteria that are part of us are a really important part of us. And, the same is true for a cabbage and a soybean and a wheat plant. And so, microorganisms are everywhere. And, if we are continually wiping out the bacteria, in our gut with antibiotics, on our hands with antibacterial cleansing products, in the environments around us with other, antibacterial cleansing products, then, it makes us ultimately more vulnerable rather than less vulnerable to those limited range of bacteria that have the potential to make us sick. So in terms of, the system of like a jar of sauerkraut or kimchi, it's the bacteria that makes it so safe. So, okay, statistically speaking, fermented vegetables are safer than the vegetables are raw. 2 weeks ago, there was an outbreak in the US of salmonella connected to onions. 1 year it was spinach, 1 year it was lettuce, 1 year it was tomatoes. I mean, clearly there is the possibility of, crops being contaminated. Usually it's runoff, of manure runoff from a factory farm uphill. It could just as well be, someone who failed to wash their hands at the right time handling the vegetables. Like, cells of potentially pathogenic bacteria can get on our food. But if you were to take a, onion that had been contaminated by, manure from another farm and chop it up with some cabbage and some other vegetables, the indigenous bacteria will always dominate. And the lactic acid bacteria, every single time you get vegetables submerged under liquid, they will dominate. And so if there happen to be some cells of salmonella or other potential pathogens, what's very convenient for us is that the bacteria that are pathogenic to us can't survive in a sufficiently acidic environment. So, as it acidifies, for manufacturers, the magic number in terms of pH is 4.6. All the manufacturers that I know measure the pH, and they have to sort of, document that the pH of each batch gets down to 4.6, at which point there's just no theoretical possibility that anything that could be dangerous to us can survive. I've become friendly with a microbiologist who's employed by the USDA in North Carolina, at North Carolina State in Raleigh, but according to their statistics, there has never been one single case documented of food poisoning or illness from fermented vegetables. Now, that's not to say that there's never been cases of food poisoning related to cheese or related to salamis, but in the realm of fermenting raw vegetables, there's just no case history and nothing to be afraid of. And this is an issue that I've been confronting since the first time I taught a workshop in 1998. People looked at the jars of vegetables we just shredded up and said, how can I be sure I have good bacteria growing in here and not some dangerous bacteria that might make me sick or kill somebody? And because nobody ever gets sick from sauerkraut. It's the process of fermenting the vegetables makes them even safer than they were raw. With every ferment, it's important to understand the parameters you're trying to create. The practice of fermentation is about manipulating environmental conditions in ways that encourage the growth of the organisms that you want and simultaneously discouraging the growth of organisms that you don't want. And so, you need to know, okay, am I trying to get these vegetables submerged? Is there a particular temperature range I'm trying to stay within? But, as long as you understand what kind of environment you're trying to create, there's no reason to project anxiety on it. The practice of fermentation has been passed down through generations in all of these different places around the world because it is so effective. And a preservation method that 90% of the time works out well and 10% of the time is dangerous to eat does not get passed down through the generations. These are time-tested techniques.
And so I feel like give it a go, right? That's where a lot of it comes back down to. I've tried to persuade my own friends to ferment, and that hesitation, it sometimes really feels like just beyond those basic steps to take, just give it a go and to see how easy it is.
Exactly. I mean, sometimes it is deceptively easy.
Someone's just asked about testing pH, and I don't actually use these for fermentation because I just kind of taste it and I'm not selling it, but and you might be able to speak better to this, Sandor, but I do have some. I bought these on Amazon or something.
So that's the simplest, low tech, low dollar way to do it is with litmus paper that you probably played with in high school chemistry class or something like that. So, I mean, that's the easiest thing. I mean, there's certainly tools. There's certainly like electronic tools that are pH meters, but like any kind of electronic tool, it requires calibration. So that's the complication of using a tool like that. But they're not so hard to calibrate. There's a lot of things with known constant pHs that you can use to calibrate them. So I don't use one. I mean, there's really no reason for home fermenters to do it. Just because it is, it always happens that the pH goes down. And you can easily taste it. And, some people prefer a milder ferment where the pH doesn't go as far down because they prefer milder flavors that aren't as acidic. But, I think for most people, just like using your tongue and your subjective powers of evaluation, are absolutely sufficient.
Yeah. I wanted to ask another one of my questions, and I hope this isn't too much of a selfish question, but I think most gardeners, you know, a lot of people come to fermentation because when you're gardening, you often produce a surplus, and then how do you preserve the surplus? You end up fermenting it. And part of my gardening journey has been to realize that there's so much more to a lot of the plants that we grow that are edible that we don't currently eat. So like this kind of like tail to tip idea for vegetables, and using the whole plant and all that kind of stuff. And just reading through your book, there were a few moments where things jumped out where I was like, oh, like you can eat that type of thing. And I was just curious if there was anything you came across in all your journeys where it's really made you rethink like a plant or something that was so unique that you were like, oh my, like just shocked by it in a way that might jump out to you. I'll share the one that I read that surprised me. Although in retrospect, it shouldn't have surprised me, but that you had a little anecdote about, I think, a parsley root kraut when you were in Italy. And I was like, wow, parsley root, I've got to try that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Europe, there are some, sort of the way, like, celery root is the root of any celery, but there are varieties of, you can buy seeds for celery root. That's a plant that just has a massive root on it. And parsley root, I think, is like that, where rather than just, you can get the flavor of it from the root of parsley, but it's bred for tenderness of the root. And so, it's sort of a distinctive variety of parsley that's been selected for these qualities in the root.
Gotcha.
But sure, well, okay. The plant that I kind of want to talk about to answer that question is cassava.
Ooh,
so, obviously, people in North Carolina and people in Tennessee aren't growing cassava. It's a tropical plant.
I grew it this year.
Oh my God.
We were working it out. That's part of my project, which we're obviously not talking about tonight, but we're working with some tropical perennials and working out how to grow them in this region. I'll have to send you some stuff and you can start growing it. But please tell us about cassava.
Well, I'm so into cassava and interested in cassava and all of the, quite varied food ways that have developed around cassava around the world. But in Colombia, I tried, so cassava in the Amazon, which is thought to be the sort of, origin place of cassava, and in West Africa and in some other places, grows with extremely high levels of cyanide. And there's various strategies that people use, including fermentation, to break down the cyanide and make the cassava safe to eat. But in a lot of the Amazon cultures, what they do is they grate the cassava and then squeeze it, like wring it out and get as much of the juice out of it as possible. And the cyanide compounds are really concentrated in the juice. So sometimes once they squeeze it out, they'll go ahead and cook with like use the, the grated fibrous part. For various kinds of food, but in the Amazon, they'll ferment the toxic juice of the cassava. The cyanide compounds break down, and then they cook it down, cook it, reduce it, sometimes with other things, and it becomes this like tarry paste with like such an exciting flavor. I just loved, it's called tucupi. And I was very moved by a film that my hosts in Colombia, which was a few years ago, they made a film since then, going and visiting this Amazon indigenous group, but just how important this plant is to this people, to these people, and how many different important foods and beverages they get out of different parts of the plant, including the toxic juice. So, I think, for cultures that, are really organized around particular important plants, I mean, it's like every part of the plant is sacred, and, and they use it. They're not just growing it for like one part of the plant and throwing the rest of it away.
Sure. Yeah. That's awesome. I feel like I've got to ask, although no, I'm just going to ask, what have you ever found any fermentations or been presented with a fermented product that was just too much, like that you, or at least my guess is that you probably tried it anyway, but is there anything that gave you pause, or you were just like, thank you?
Well, I mean, sure I have. I mean, a lot of times the thing that gave me pause was like an idea. Sometimes, I mean, I wrote in Art of Fermentation a little section about salamis, and the word botulism comes from the Latin word for cured sausages, botulus. And but before the invention of canning 215 years ago, botulism was a very obscure disease that occasionally occurred in aged sausages like salamis, and there's been a lot of scientific study of it, and the way that in modern production we make salamis without worrying about botulism is by using curing salts, sodium nitrite, sodium nitrate, which have a certain amount of bad press of their own. A lot of people avoid them because they think that they're carcinogenic, although they are salts found in nature. If you like to eat celery is incredibly high in sodium nitrate. So, I mean, personally, I don't think it's a problem unless it's eaten in very high concentration. But sometimes people have presented me with like, oh, this is my homemade salami, and this is so good because I haven't used any nitrite or nitrate. And not because it smelled bad or anything, but I've sometimes been like, that's okay, I don't want to try that. But mostly I've tried everything that people have presented me with. I won't pretend that I've liked everything the first time I tasted it. I mean, certainly the first time I tried natto, I did not like it especially, but I just received a lot of encouragement to give it another try. And I think, as I think about this concept that we call acquired tastes, like a lot of the flavors of fermentation, like people don't love the first time they try them. And, I mean, my own journey with cheese, like I always liked cheese. I always liked some cheeses, but when I was a kid, like blue cheese was scary to me. Other kinds of molded cheese were scary to me. And it sort of, I didn't immediately like the smell. It took me a long time to even try them. And when I first tried them, I wasn't crazy about the flavor. But the fact that I saw people, including my parents, taking such pleasure in them gave me a reason to try them again. I don't know anyone who liked beer the first time they tasted it. I don't know anyone who liked coffee the first time they tasted them. A lot of the flavors of fermentation, take a little bit of getting used to, but once you key into what's so delicious about them, like they're totally unique. And like, I love natto now. This guy, Bill Shurtleff, who wrote some of the classic books about fermentation, the Book of Tempeh and the Book of Miso. Yeah. When Wild Fermentation came out, he sent me a sweet, sweet email telling me how much he liked the book and telling me some things that he felt like were glaring omissions to him. And one of them was natto. And he described natto as having a taste like camembert cheese, and a relatively short, simple fermentation that just takes about 24 hours. And, I really like camembert cheese, and he was someone I admired a lot. So I was like, I got to give this another try. And now I love natto. I make natto all the time.
Yeah.
And there's a lot in the book about natto and about some cousins of natto, which are dried, which I have discovered many people who are put off by natto find much more acceptable.
Interesting. We're getting close to the time at the top, and I don't know if we've got time for any more audience questions. We've had a couple of comments talking about how much they respect your work and agreeing with you on natto being an acquired taste. But
can't we have a book entitled Cousin of Natto? I think an idea was born right there, which I really love that. And the graphic novel. Okay, it's there. I put it out there. I put
Cousin
it out
of natto. So there is in here somewhere. There's a section of on cousins of natto. So far it's a section, but not its own book.
Not a graphic novel.
Sandor, what's next for you?
Well, right now I'm mostly focused on trying to promote this book and doing events like this. And I just was in New York, and in a week I'm going to Oregon. So I'm just trying to get it out there for now. And I've actually published 2 books in 2 years, so I'm looking forward to a period of not working on a book actually.
Okay, that's fair enough.
But fermentation is just such a constant in my kitchen and in my life that, I think it'll be a few years before I'm out with any more books. But I certainly will keep on tinkering away in the kitchen, and it's very intimately connected to what's going on in my garden. Both of those will continue to be a focus in my life.
I wanted to quickly throw out that, just because no one's got the visual, but it's got so many beautiful photographs throughout the book that is a little shift from the art of fermentation. I know Fermentation and Metaphor had some beautiful photographs in, but yeah, it feels really beautiful to have that, it's well designed and laid out, and it's a real beautiful book. So I just wanted to make sure that people that are listening a long way from a bookstore knew that it's a pleasure to read as well as well written.
That's a nice segue to thank the publisher as well, Chelsea Green Publishing, who published both of your books. So I think that's
all of my books have been published by them, and I mean they've been such a pleasure to work with. I feel like I really found a good niche.
They're very supportive.
We want to thank you so much, Sandor and Chris, for a lively, sparkling conversation full of information and I think inspiration too. And behind you, Sandor, if that set of shelves and this almost like the alchemy going on behind you, I think that we need some pictures of that too, and something I don't know, I love it. Some close-ups and some, they're all like little characters to me. It's like Santa's workshop back there or something. I don't know. I like it a lot, but it's really beautiful. Thank you both so much. Congratulations, Sandor, on this latest book, Sandor Katz, Fermentation Journeys. We appreciate you, audience, being here this evening. And please take a look at your email to see about getting Fermentation as Metaphor. We want to thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.